The problem with what's happened in the UK is deregulation without concern for how that is likely to, or was then likely to, and clearly has affected our, I guess, industrial structure, if you like, such that where it has led to is basically a combination of deindustrialization in terms of, real material goods, complete dominance of finance, in particular, housing, right? Housing is monetized. Median home price versus median wages, right? Just up and up and up forever, to the point where it's now just like a trope. It's like something that people basically accept. I mean, I think they should be angrier about it. No young person can afford a home.
Ready. Alan, how you doing?
Very well. How are you?
Good, man. Good to see you.
Mr. Obnoxious.
Yes.
Love the new place, by the way.
Thank you very much.
I was thinking, just immediately before we started, this is the first time that we've recorded, or that I've recorded, in person in the UK, which I guess is part of what you're going for, right?
Is this the first time I've seen you in person in the UK?
It may even be that, yeah. Oh, no, Bedford.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. Of course. How can I forget? Lovely Bedford. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we love it. Yeah, this place came out of nowhere and we snapped it up, and it's about perfect, really, isn't it?
It's been great. Yeah.
Yeah, very happy, very excited to get the show live. Tomorrow it goes, first episode. And yeah. And interestingly, you were one of the first people we wanted to get on, and the reason being, well, I'll tell you the reason being is, and it kind of aligns to why we flipped the show, right? Is that you get to a point you're like, we were just a bunch of guys talking to each other about the same stuff over and over again, and just became like a circular conversation. But there's lots of my friends who are, family and people I know who are, I think, going through a managed decline, either not realizing it or realizing it and not knowing what the problem is. Yeah. And whilst I don't think Bitcoin is the answer to everything, I certainly think some of the financial education that I've had over the last 7 years is particularly useful, but we don't want that barrier in the way. It's just like, here are some facts. And one thing that stood out for me recently, it's been one of the most important things I've seen, and is the Malay speech to the World Economic Forum.
Yeah.
And I tell you why. It's because I think wrongly, I've been thinking of this slide into socialism as being a left-wing issue, but it's not really. It is he coined the term collectivism, and I don't think there's very much difference between any of these parties in any country. One's just a little bit more conservative, one's a bit more socialist, but the issues will happen that we're going to cover today with either. So we felt like you were a great person to get into with this.
Well, my tagline on this show, as you know, is I don't even like Bitcoin that much. I just hate fiat. So that's a good setup for what we're going to cover, I guess.
Yeah, but what is fiat?
What is fiat?
Yeah, I've got a question on that as well.
How long am I supposed to spend answering this? But
answer it like fiat is a term we've all used and coined.
I see what you mean. Yeah. No, that's kind of a fun segue. Yeah. So I mean, I guess the straightforward answer is that it's the type of money that we have inherited, right? So as opposed to kind of dry economics jargon, as opposed to a commodity money where it's like gold or rye stones or something, if you want to get really into it on the Bitcoin lore side, rather than the money being something that has physical exchange value. It is trying to remember the exact etymology of it. I'm pretty sure, I don't speak Latin, but I'm pretty sure fiat means by decree in Latin. And so the idea is that we'll get into the nuances of this, I'm sure, but kind of the state, kind of the banking cartel that issues the money is just decreeing that it has value and everyone else has to go along with that, rather than the value coming from the market, from people actually agreeing freely that it has value. I think what you were hinting at, though, which is quite funny, is that Bitcoiners, I think, and probably solely, correct me if you have different interpretation of this, but I think over the past maybe decade or so, Bitcoiners are solely, or at least primarily, responsible for turning fiat, like the word fiat into a kind of catch-all insult for, is there tongue-in-cheek, like not entirely seriously, but anything that seems, artificially short-termist or materialistic or hedonistic or something along those lines, as opposed to more prudent long-term thinking, that kind of behavior is fiat, which I like. I definitely indulge in this.
Well, it became a catch-all term that we needed to use, which gave Bitcoin separation, right? It's like a separate type of money.
Yeah.
But it's not.
Well, that's the thing, because this is what I mean by Bitcoiners have they've popularized the kind of the snarky insult as well. But this, fiat money was perfectly well understood as economics jargon, but hardly anybody in the, general population would have actually known what that meant. And I do think it's almost entirely because of Bitcoin. I mean, I don't think gold bugs really got very far in like pushing this discourse in the wider public eye. So I think it is Bitcoiners who have made people aware of what fiat even means, even if it's kind of via this more tongue-in-cheek route. I'm just remembering as well, I want to mention this quickly, that this is fresh. This is ages and ages ago. This is like 3-4 years ago or something, but it's fresh in my mind because I gave a talk in Prague where I put this up on the screen, and it was a tweet from Tracy Alloway. I'm sure you know who that is. You know who she is? No.
Nope.
You should get her on. She'd be good on this, actually. Her and Joe Weisenthal would be really good guests.
Oh, yeah.
on
No,
this.
sorry. Yeah. So Odd Lots.
Yes.
Yeah, I do.
She had a tweet like 3-4, I forget exactly when. And I think actually she was also joking. She wasn't being serious about this at all. Like, she was drawing attention to how funny this is, but she was saying something like, he was such a fiat boyfriend, Becky. I'm so glad you got rid of him, something like that. And I was like, this is how I put it up to be like, this is how you all need to start using this word. Like, we need to get it out there more.
Well, so I think if you wandered down to Trafalgar Square and you said to a bunch of people, like, to explain what fiat is, forget the car. No, we don't mean the car. What is it? I don't think many will. Yes, we will use it as natural language, expecting people to understand what it is. And there's also people on the edge, someone like an Eric Weinstein. If you talk to him, he will use it, but he won't use it in such natural language. He will say something more along the lines of like fiat money, like you guys refer to. And then, as you said, it's also become this pejorative to describe anything that as a Bitcoiner I don't like, which is potentially short-termist. Although, again, that's a whole interesting thing to discuss, because I actually do think, when I see something like they say, oh, that's fiat architecture, and then they'll show some cathedral from the 14th century, like, well, hold on, there is efficiencies as well, and different levels of kinds of engineering. So not everything is fiat, but yeah. So for anyone listening, that's what fiat is.
Well, I think there's, taking it slightly out of being tongue-in-cheek, I think you're kind of touching on what an interesting difficulty in popularizing this is. And it's very, very difficult with Bitcoin, but even with, kind of the inverse of Bitcoin, if you like, everything that's fiat, which is that, okay, yes, not everything is entirely fiat, but probably everything is like a little bit fiat. And it's really difficult to draw people's attention to that without sounding like a lunatic, basically. Without sounding like quite literally a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm even trying to say to people, look, I'm not being a nutter here. I'm not being a conspiracy theorist here, but just so you
But we would have more cathedrals.
Yeah. But I just want you to understand that, because the people I find it really hard to get to, the hardest to communicate with, are those who are from a more socialist, left-wing, political ideology.
I actually haven't found that, but go on. I'll give my perspective after.
But trying to explain to them, by the way, all your ideas are terrible and they harm the people you're trying to protect the most. Yeah. Not all your ideas.
That's not really a Bitcoin issue, though.
The economic framework that you live by, whilst you think it's right and whilst you think it's helping the people you want to help, it's actually harming them the most. And your ideas are actually benefiting the richest the most. But this is like one of the reasons to kind of like make this show and flip it, is that I don't care. You can think Bitcoin's weird. I don't care. I want to get people in the idea of there's money and there are assets, and they do two different things. You need to understand the two of them. You can understand, and you need to understand how money degrades and gets debased, and you need to understand how assets are for the long term. You can ignore Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just an option within the asset bucket for you. The rest is property and artwork and gold and whatever. But get into that world, because I think if you just stay in the fiat money world, unless you have an incredible career or build an incredible business, you're being attacked almost on a daily basis without even realizing it.
Yeah. Well, the reason I shouldn't say I disagree. It's obviously just we've had different experiences trying to talk to people about this. I was surprised with who you mentioned as being the most difficult. And this, I think, will be a really nice segue into what I know you do want to talk about. So for people who are, I guess, left-wing, or socialist, whatever, I don't mean this as, derogatory, just however they describe themselves, right? If they describe themselves as socialist, I've found that a very easy angle to get them interested in this is tapping into their probably, I wouldn't say that literally every single person in that camp would have this, but as a stereotype, I think it's pretty good. Their extreme cynicism and skepticism, if not outright aggression, around the financial sector, which where you'll probably want to go with the segue is that in their minds, that's capitalism. Obviously, I don't think it is at all, but for the most part, I think they're right to be suspicious and cynical and even aggressive. They maybe don't quite understand the context of what it is they're attacking, but they are right to be upset about it, I think. And so I actually haven't found that much difficult. I mean, I'm maybe not the best messenger there either, right? Like there's plenty of people within Bitcoin who that's kind of their shtick is speaking to those people in that language and on those terms. Where I've actually found the most difficulty, it's almost the inverse of that. It's people who I wouldn't even necessarily identify on the basis of their politics, although you could probably guess what their politics is. I would imagine there's a similar stereotype there, but is people who work in finance, because to them, there's a whole bunch of reasons here. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole because I know it's not exactly what you want to talk about, but I would always
go
come
wherever
back,
you want, man.
Well, I'd always come back to just a massive fan of Jesse Myers. So at the time he wrote it as Croesus. He was still using that pseudonym then, but he's since come out as Jesse Myers. His article, "Why the Yuppie Elite Dismiss Bitcoin," and it captures this so perfectly. And I think more importantly for me, the reason I relate to it is that I would say like I am the Yuppie elite, but we had very similar professional backgrounds. And so what he was describing as his struggle in talking to people about this, I just immediately related to and thought it was genius. And it's very short, very well written, very clear. I spammed it to everyone that I thought might, tip over the edge a little bit at the time when it was like 3-4 years ago or something. But that's honestly where I have the most difficulty, because I think that maybe just to contrast it with, again, self-described socialists and tapping into things they dislike. For the Yuppie elite, like TradFi, people high up in TradFi, people successful in the, let's say, Western financial system, I don't know what it is I'm supposed to be tapping into that they don't like. Like, they have a pretty sweet life.
But is that just because they benefit from that system as it is?
Yeah, exactly.
But I don't know if they know why they're benefiting from that system.
That's why it's hard. Yeah.
And I don't know if they're prepared for a potential change.
This is the thing. Like, you have to be very, from my experience at least, you have to be very delicate with it, because it's obviously a poor, just in general, never mind for this, it's a very poor tactic to try to convince someone by saying, by the way, your entire career and existence and life is all a scam. Like, think on your sins. Like, no one's going to listen to that. So, but it is also sort of what I mean. So I need to like dance around it and like pick holes at it here and there and kind of let it dawn on them over time. It's honestly, this is going back to what I was picking up on to begin with. For me, it's been a much harder sell. It's much more, I don't mean difficult in the sense of like awkward, just unsuccessful conversation to have, as opposed to someone who, again, they think of themselves as a socialist, and you just rail against the big banks and it's fine. You just get along immediately.
Well, there's a parallel for that with the immigration issues that we're having at the moment. So, whenever I meet somebody who's anti-immigration, angry about immigration, angry about the number of people coming here, ideally, I want them to read Alex Gladstein's book, but I try and explain to them about structural adjustment and the reason you get cheap shit is because we've impoverished these countries, and some of these people are leaving because they cannot survive and cope, and that's why they're coming here. So we are the cause of a lot of the exodus from these countries, and I don't think it's ever been framed to them in that way, and it's kind of a difficult one because there is a shame that comes with it. There totally is a shame. So there's a total parallel there where you're trying to say, okay, fine, but here's a reality. It's a bit of a wet fish to the face.
Yeah.
Well, we will do our best. And I think, look, I think the main two things I think we want to get through today is the issues with socialist style policies. And we always have to be careful with our terminology here, because socialism is basic communism. We aren't actually living in a communist state, but there's certainly things, certain policies that feel very socialist or push us down, like cause many of the issues that pure socialism causes. But the antidote isn't the version of capitalism we're living through at the moment, because that is also terrible. It's also in some ways socialism for the rich.
Yeah.
So there's like two shitty versions of organizational structure, economic structure, that are failing the majority of people, like including in some ways the people at this table in certain ways. And I think it's funny. Austin Hill.
Yes.
Yeah. So I hadn't spoken to him for a while, but I speak to him regularly, and he just come to me and he just said, this is one of the most important issues that we need to deal with right now, and it needs to become the mission for everyone, is to communicate this. And I think actually you can communicate this without the answer just being, here's Bitcoin. Just get people to understand the problem, and that's a huge issue, especially in the face of governments who either, I don't know, are they so stupid that they don't understand the idea, or do they know the problem but know they can't deal with it because they won't be re-elected, or are they just evil? I'm like, where on the spectrum is it stupidity, or are they evil?
Yeah. I mean, my stance on this, I think I've said this on the previous podcast in probably similar-ish terms, is basically that it kind of doesn't matter who's in charge. It's almost not a political issue in my mind, in the sense of like electoral politics. It's largely the structure of the financial system, if you like. I mean, basically, you're just dancing around saying it's like fiat money, right? It's how fiat money works that simply compels these incentives on whoever. You were saying
emergent properties of.
Yeah, I guess you could put it that way. Yeah, you said a while ago, 10, 20 minutes ago, that you don't see, I forget exactly how you worded it, you can rephrase this if you want, but you don't see any meaningful differentiation across political parties. I assume you meant in the UK, but probably in the US, probably anywhere we're really familiar with.
No, I do. I see meaningful differentiation.
On this, I mean, sorry, not on everything.
No, in terms of policies, but I think if you're going to attach the word socialism to, it's usually left-wing parties, you can still, in large part, attach it then to conservative parties.
Oh, I think, yeah, definitely.
Because
I think so, yeah.
It's a spectrum of socialism.
Well, I think there's very easy just to kind of diffuse political tension in having this conversation. I don't mean like between you and me, but if you're having it with somebody else, it's just very easy to point out to, assuming the context is somewhat like English speaking, right? Like in the US, I don't have the exact figures off the top of my head, but I know that this is roughly true. The federal deficit went up considerably more under the past handful of Republican presidents than it did Democrats, right? So that's like one example. They can harp on all they want about free markets, but ultimately they don't. The evidence is that they don't really give a shit. If you look at what they do rather than what they say. And then equally in the UK, that there's maybe kind of a spicier one, but I'd say that the situation we're now in terms of, probably the simplest way of describing what I'm getting at is how financialized everything is. Like we have a basically fake economy at this point. That's mostly down to Thatcher-era conservatives.
Huh.
And it's just, and do you know what's super interesting about that too? You were mentioning, I think you used the expression, it's like socialism for the rich. They obviously wouldn't have called it that when they were enacting the reforms that led to a lot of what I think is now deeply unjust. But functionally, that is more or less the consequence of it in combination with fiat money. And so this goes back to a really good point from before too, that fiat isn't all of anything, which is why it's kind of weirdly elusive and hard to, not sound like a conspiracy theorist. But it is part of probably everything. And, throwing it in those contexts. Both of those, by the way, we can go into either in more detail if you want. I'm probably more comfortable with the UK one, just knowing more about it, and I assume you are too, right? Because we lived through it. But both of those examples are quite good to, as I said a minute or two ago, kind of diffuse the idea that, if we just elect, the right-wing party, or we kick out the left-wing party, it's significantly more entrenched than that. You can't just elect Milei, basically. It's at least not here. In Argentina, it seems to be going pretty well so far, but I think they'll run into this too.
I've always felt these are emergent properties of a fiat system, but combined with an economic cycle that's misaligned with the political cycle.
Yeah.
And so when you have a political cycle that's misaligned with an economic cycle, parties want to win whatever.
Yep.
It's football. It's sport. They want to win whatever. Therefore, they will do policies that are not in the net best interest of the country, but are in the net best interest of power.
Yep.
And that misalignment is really obvious to me. That's why I don't vote anymore. It's stupid. But I would be really interested to understand these policies under Thatcher, which caused this. Because I'm not a Thatcherite. I'm not a historian. So I
just
lived
clear,
through
I'm not either. I'm not putting myself forward as a historian of that exact era or anything. It's just, in my mind at least, it's fairly straightforward to link. All I really mean by Thatcherite policies is basically deregulation of finance. And to be clear, my point here isn't that finance or really anything ought to be regulated. I'm far more in the other, at least politically on that issue. Would in general favor deregulation of just about anything. But the problem with what's happened in the UK is deregulation without concern for how that is likely to, or was then likely to, and clearly has affected our, I guess, industrial structure, if you like, such that where it has led to is basically a combination of deindustrialization in terms of, real material goods, complete dominance of finance, and in particular exporting finance for the overall economy. And then there's pretty immediately downstream effects of that too. So this is maybe even linking back to how do you talk to regular people about this without either sounding crazy or throwing out all this economic jargon or whatever. In the UK in particular, housing, right? Housing is monetized.
Yep.
No young person can afford a home. It's just not, you look at graphs of again, I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but median home price versus median wages, right? Just up and up and up forever, to the point where it's now just like a trope. It's like something that people basically accept. I mean, I think they should be angrier about it, but it's well, of course I don't own a home. Nobody owns a home. What do you say?
I can anecdotally explain this from the perspective of my son. He wants to buy a house. Mm-hmm. He fortunately is one of the people who can, because I'm his dad. He now holds Bitcoin, and he's held it for a good period of time where he has enough for a deposit. He's not going to buy a house because he's not going to sell that Bitcoin for a deposit, because he knows that's a better asset to hold longer term. But he wants to buy a house. My first house I bought when I was 24. It was $100,000. I had to put down a $5,000 deposit. That same house now, where I live in Bedford, we're talking 20 years on probably, is now over £250,000.
That's inflation.
Yeah, that's inflation.
That's real inflation.
That's real inflation.
It's not 2% CPI or whatever.
Just a nice normal flat in Bedford. You get a nice one. It's not like the cheapest one on Rightmove. Is a couple $100,000, and my son needs over £20,000 deposit. So that's a 4x deposit requirement to get onto the ladder for a flat rather than a house. And so that is real inflation. You're totally right, and it is an issue. And it's my assumption is just going to get worse and worse.
It can only get worse. Yeah. This is right back to my thesis on how this even interlinks with politics. You can't vote this away. There's nothing you can do about this. I mean, I guess other than Bitcoin, I don't necessarily want to go down that rabbit hole right now. But it's a deeply structural problem with how fiat money works that you just can't change politically. You can't change democratically. I guess other than going on a Bitcoin standard or something, but I don't think even that that now sounds crazy again. So Good luck convincing people of that.
Well, so look, imagine someone's listening to this show. They're like, I've sent them a copy. I said, look, forget the Bitcoin thing. I just want you, because I care about you and I love you, I want you to just understand a little bit more about the financial system, how it works against you, and maybe you'll pick up some lessons on how to protect yourself long term by understanding the difference between money and wealth. Okay, if someone was new coming to this, what do you think are the most important things? Just a normal person who's got a normal job, they don't run their own business, they're a salaried employee, they're probably going to be for the rest of their life. They want to retire in 20, 25 years. What do you think are the most important things they need to understand
honestly,
right now?
I think there's one thing.
Great.
I've distilled this down, I think. And on the basis that, I mean, obviously you guys know this, that I've thought about this and written about this, spoken about this in very kind of abstract terms, philosophical, historical analyses, whatever, which I think what you're getting at is, that only works on some people, which I'm well aware of. Like, for the most part, it's only those people that I historically at least have wanted to try to appeal directly to, basically via Twitter and like Bitcoin conferences and that kind of thing. But to massively simplify it, I think without losing any accuracy, frankly, either, the problem is that you can't save. I think everything is, no matter what direction you want to go, like I think we're planning on covering most of this anyway. That
you can't save, or it's hard to save.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. It's I think we're kind of splitting hairs there. It depends what you deem to be an acceptable ability to save, I guess, is how you would marry those two. I mean, obviously, yes, it is hard to save, but I think just to be even more blunt about it and say you can't with money. I mean, that's a key part. Sorry, you can't save with money. So you have to find other means to have like ersatz savings, and that is where all the horrible social downstream effects are.
So if we crystallize a story around saving, because there's a lot you can unpack in that. There's a number of different stories or paths we can go down to explain the issues with money, thinking long term versus short term, which is really, it's really interesting. I don't know what it was like with your parents or even yours, Danny, but I remember growing up, my dad had savings. He had a number of savings. He had, I want to say, an annuity accounts. He had general savings. He had bank savings. And the kind of interest rates we're seeing now that people are freaking out about, they were normal back then. You used to get a good interest rate. You used to put money in the bank and you would get a solid interest rate, which is something that hasn't really existed in my adult life. We've almost been gaslighted away from that. Yeah. So, I mean, I wouldn't say, I would never use the term "you can't save." I would want to tell the story of how it's difficult to save and the other ways you can save. But you also want to explain to people why you should save. I think we've got an impending pension crisis coming in that, which is twofold. One, pensions are losing value. Also, people don't have pensions.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot even there that we can unpack that intimately tied up with looming pension crisis is proliferation of finance as, I'd say, effectively a market reaction to the inability to save, or the difficulty, let's say, to save, which I also have. I was kind of alluding to this before with the yuppie elite, right? It was in a more jokey context then, but I think that has pretty serious, if largely intangible, social consequences. And then again, just the most obvious version of this is that, well, you can't save with money. It's difficult to save with money. People save with real estate instead. But that's, again, I don't even need to explain why. I don't think need to explain why that's horrible that that's happening en masse. Because yes, it leads to, it's a scarce resource.
When the money isn't, what is it Jeff says?
When the money isn't scarce, everything else is.
Yeah.
And it's, more importantly, it's a resource that people need, right? You can't not have housing. And so the fact that housing has effectively become, I wouldn't say money, I'd say, well, it has monetized on the basis that it is a savings instrument, because fiat money can't be, or it's very difficult for it to be. That has horrific social consequences that I guess everybody sees, but probably very few, at least in political discourse, let's say, isn't addressed. It's only Bitcoiners who whine about this, I think.
There have been historical periods of inflation previously, but have they been short, sharp periods of inflation, or are you saying that money is always, fiat money has always been something that you can't really save in, or are we in a new paradigm now since the 2008 financial crisis whereby it's never coming back as a savings tool?
I mean, it depends what you even mean by inflation. I don't mean to be too pedantic about that, but I mean, before you were saying how much the value of your house has gone up, and my response was, well, that's inflation, right? I don't think something like CPI, that's well covered, like how nonsense that is. I think probably M2 is what you have to treat as, or some measure of, the money supply as created by banks that is, currently existing, that is, if you want to get mildly technical about it, I guess, is sort of bank liabilities in the form of issued debt that haven't yet been cancelled and frankly never will be. That's just never going to end. I'm pushing back slightly on the way you're asking the question, not because I disagree with it, but because it's kind of not my specialty. I'm not so bothered by, I shouldn't say bothered. I'm not so intellectually interested in the minutiae of when precisely has inflation been worse and why. I'm far more interested in the bigger picture of what, if anything, can actually realistically ever be done about this. And I'm very much in the camp of, again, I'll throw out some resources I really, really like. Parker Lewis's Ender's Game was, I think, pivotal for my education, frankly, on this topic. I think that's one of the seminal pieces that kind of converted me as such into being as hardcore of a Bitcoiner as I have been for a while now. And I can't, it's 30 pages long or something. I can't possibly do it justice, but the very, the TLDR is basically this can't ever stop. It can be massaged in the short term, but in the longer and longer run, it will only get worse and worse.
Okay. All right. Let's come at a different angle then. Mm-hmm. So I don't know anything about Bitcoin, gold, assets. I'm not an asset person. I have a job. I earn a fairly decent salary, $80,000 a year, say. And you say I can't save, and I'll say, well, I've got an ISA. I've got an interest account which I put £300 a month in. I've got my kids' savings accounts. I put £50 a month in. I'm saving. Mm-hmm. What am I missing? What are the problems I'm facing?
There's two things there. So one is that to the extent you're trying to save in fiat money, the purchasing power will be significantly less at the time you actually want to spend it, right? You want to consume with what you've saved, which defeats the purpose of saving, right? The point of saving is it's almost like the definition in some sense, if you were to give a sensible definition, is preserving purchasing power, right? Storing it into the future rather than utilizing it right now. So that's point number one. Point number two is, and this is the conflation that I think is far more insidious, and it relates to a couple of things I mentioned before. We can maybe go into more detail. Because as I've insisted, maybe you're probably right. I shouldn't say you can't save with money, but it's a lot more difficult to save with money than it should be. So what people typically do, and what happens via pension liabilities, is that not only is real estate monetized, but securities are by which, sorry, that's kind of financially jargon. The interest in company ownership and debt is by and large what securities means. That also becomes monetized. So people are forced to preserve purchasing power. They're forced to attempt to preserve purchasing power by what they maybe think of as saving, what they maybe think of as investing even, but frankly is just speculation. That in a bit more of an involved way that is maybe worth us unpacking, has a similarly insidious effect to monetizing real estate, because these things should have standalone value, right? They have functions and purposes, and they should be priced properly. I mean, basically everything should, ideally everything would be priced properly, but they're not, because people are forcing their attempt to preserve purchasing power into them. I think it's considerably worse with securities than it is with real estate, though, although there's a lot of overlap in the point I'm going to make, because that's what gives rise to a significantly larger and more parasitic financial services industry that, right back to what we started off talking about, the socialists get very mad at in terms of, big bankers too big to fail, which I'm entirely sympathetic to, because this is just different perspectives on the same problem. There would be no too big to fail big bankers for socialists to be mad at, or I shouldn't say there would be none. There would be considerably less to be mad at in the first place, were it not for the incentives created by fiat money. So not all, but I think a very large proportion of financial services industry is basically a market reaction to the inability to save, or the difficulty, sorry. I'll try to get that right from now on, so I don't need to keep correcting myself, but the difficulty for individuals, that's also a key point, individuals to save with money, hence they need to have this function be intermediated for them, giving rise to this massively parasitic industry, which even then, this is probably a bit further away in the conversation, but which I think has pretty insidious social consequences, even aside from that injustice. Like, I think it gets even worse than that in even less tangible ways.
I think this is where like a growing part of the population would probably blame capitalism.
Yeah.
Which again,
yeah, I'm sure they would. Yeah.
I'm very sympathetic to that. But you wrote, one of the chapters in your book was, "This is not capitalism." Yep. Do you want to explain why the current system is not capitalism, despite what a lot of people think?
Yeah, sure. So I'd probably start off with saying, there's maybe an amusing comparison here. You were saying before about how Bitcoiners say fiat. They do it tongue in cheek, right? But they basically just mean something I don't like, right? Mm-hmm. And there's kind of, it's oddly similar to, I don't know if you guys have read a very good essay by Orwell, Politics in the English Language. Highly recommend it to your audience if they haven't read it either. But one of the things he says in there is that people tend to use the word fascist in the same way as well. It doesn't really mean it. It's been kind of diluted. Totally. It just means something I don't like. It's like something political I don't like is You just call it fascist. I think the reason I'm bringing this up is that I think for a lot of people, they used capitalist in the same way. Mm-hmm. Probably not in a similar way, I should say. Not as synonymous with like fascist, or certainly not with fiat, obviously, but to mean something like a greedy, economic outcome. Yeah, anything vaguely to do with economics or finance that they don't like. They just call it capitalist.
Yeah.
And I think this is deeply, deeply misguided because, let me see if I can, like how simply I can communicate this. I think that obviously we've been through quite a lot, and we'll probably dig into it even more, why I think so many of the consequences of fiat money are what these people really have a problem with, and the problem is the ultimate source of the problems, if not what they identify as the problems themselves, is fiat. In my mind, though, it's really the reason I take so much issue with it is that it's just kind of abusing the meanings of these words, and in the same way as like Orwell's complaining about with fascism. It's just diluting what you could even potentially mean by capitalism. Mm-hmm. To my mind, I don't have an exact definition, but I have kind of minimum criteria I think are surely necessary, which would be something like a system that encourages capital accumulation. So even that's kind of jargony too, encourages saving, and from savings, investment. And you can, in the essay and then in the chapter, we obviously tease this out a bit and attach a bit more kind of jargon and frills and so on to it. But that's kind of the core of it. And so the reason that frustrates me so much is that, as we've covered in a decent amount of detail already, that is directly discouraged by fiat, right? And so you have fiat money, which is creates what I think it's perfectly fair and helpful, like communicatively helpful to describe as anti-capitalistic tendencies, causing these broader social injustices that these people then refer to as capitalism. And I think they're deeply misguided. I think it's tricky though, because they
don't have a word for it.
Exactly. Yeah, they don't have a word for it. But it's very unfortunate. It's almost ironic that this is the word that they've chosen, because it confuses their thinking about it even more.
I'm largely sympathetic to it as well, though, Because
well, that's the tricky thing, right? Because the actual issues themselves are obviously worthy of sympathy, and these people are obviously right to be upset about them. This seems this it's like a trap or something. It's like a linguistic trap for them to avoid diagnosing it properly. Like they're well aware of the symptoms, right? They're tricking themselves into not being able to locate the illness, let's say.
Well, this is why sometimes I go back to government. I'm like, do they know? Do they know themselves? Do they fully understand the problem with the system? Because I'm watching this managed decline of society. I'm watching with increasing prevalence social unrest. I'm watching a rise of crime. I'm seeing increased homelessness. I'm witnessing the evisceration of the middle class. Like I'm seeing it. I can see it with my own eyes. And based on everything I've learned over the last 7 years, this is a managed decline because of the problems with Fiat. I think it's really easy to see, but the veil was lifted.
I'm honestly not. Maybe it'd be helpful for you to say what you mean by managed decline, but I'm resistant to that terminology because it sounds conspiratorial, and I don't think there's a conspiracy. I think that's what's so annoying about it, that it's like emergent. Basically, it's a consequence of the incentives that Fiat creates, and it's very difficult to pin down as a result, because you can't just be like, oh, it's this guy doing it. It's like all these, this shadowy cabal of bankers in a dark room smoking cigars or whatever. It's not that.
Well, this is where I go back to, do they know? Does Keir Starmer know? If Keir Starmer knows, then he should know the answer isn't more debt and more taxation. The answer really is some kind of financial reset or austerity program, similar to what any of us have to do. When when times are difficult, we have to rein it in.
Yeah.
That's the answer. But if his answer is more debt, which it seems to be every government's more debt, more taxation, then to me it's managed. If they know it's managed decline, it's what can we acceptably get away with, right? We can acceptably get away with adding VAT to school fees because even though that has anti-labour policies, even though that's squeezing more of the middle to lower class out of private education, and it's kind of think they're punishing the rich. They're not. They're enabling the rich because the rich can keep going. Right? What can we do with inheritance tax? That's really a rich. What can we like? All their policies to me are a managed decline, and in 4 years' time, what happens to them? They get voted out, and it's conservatives again. Again, what do? Well, we know the problem, but we won't get voted back in, so it's more of the same. So that to me is managed decline. If they know, if they don't know, then it's emergent problem of the system, but then they're too fucking stupid to be in power.
I think I've thought of a good way of kind of clarifying the terminology. You might disagree with this, I don't know. The decline is not intentional, but the management of it is, or at least is incompetent. Is that what you mean?
I mean, no, like I say, if they know the problem, if they understand the economics, and they know what the solution is, but they're not doing it because they want to maintain power,
right?
And they want to maintain popularity with the electorate.
So this is super interesting. So again, I don't want to be putting myself forward as an expert on British politics. I don't think I have anything terribly interesting to say about that. But again, there is this fairly obvious stereotype of like, oh, Labour, left wing, they'll load up on debt, whatever. I think that's overly simple. You're not saying this, to be clear, but this is like something that is out there in the discourse. But it's overly simplistic and avoids the real issue. Basically because, so for example, I'm picking up on this just because you threw out Keir Starmer in particular and some of the proposals they've come out with since coming to power just a couple of months ago.
By the way, I can equally attack Rishi Sunak's policies. Or David Cameron's.
No, this isn't about you. This is about just like the general discourse on this and how unhelpfully simplistically I think people think about it. Some of what Starmer and this Labour government has proposed is, at least just superficially, I guess, it is about dealing with the debt, right? And dealing with the deficit and trying to, you call it austerity if you want. I don't think that's a particularly helpful term. But the problem is that this gets, it's impossible for this kind of policy to, suggestion even, never mind enacting it, right? It's impossible for this to be popular And in fact, all of these suggestions were immediately railed on by the conservatives as, anti-growth or whatever, because, and this is something that this is articulated very, very well in Ender's Game, by the way, you can't ever slow down credit expansion under fiat. That's basically that's the core of the problem. That if you could do it, but everyone would immediately be impoverished, which is actually what you should do, frankly. If you're seriously long-termist about how to fix this, you need to take the pain of unwinding the debt bubble, but nobody wants to do that. And so even marginal suggestions of like, maybe we should spend a little bit less, get attacked as, you're just not worded this way, but effectively you're suggesting impoverishing people. And it's like, well, kind of, yes, but only because all of their, maybe not all, but a decent portion, let's say, of what they think of as being their wealth is fake, is bullshit, because it is a product of this credit bubble that actually I'm suggesting maybe ought to be allowed to burst, but politically it's just completely impossible. Very, very good analogy for this.
Hold on.
Oh, yeah.
Politically impossible or politically unpopular and risky for your personal
that's
career?
A good question, yeah.
And the reason I ask it is because I feel like it has to get really fucking shit for people to make change, like it did in Argentina.
Yep.
Milei came in, and I can't give you an articulated, structured kind of report on what he's done so far. Anecdotally, the things I've seen are having a positive impact.
Yep.
Okay. But they're what are seen as radical ideas that aren't being really tried anywhere else. And I go back to the same point. If you're going to be prime minister of this country, or if you're going to be the chancellor of the exchequer, you should know every option, even these ideas. And if you're choosing not to do it, to me, it's managed decline.
Yeah. To be honest, I wouldn't want to comment on the exact nature of the political calculus because I don't think that's my expertise. It is interesting, just to be clear. It's just not like nobody should care what I have to say about that. I don't even care what I have to say about that. I forgot where I was going to go with that. There was another point I wanted to make. Was it about Argentina?
I think it'd be interesting for you to explain why the unwinding of the debt bubble can't happen.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's pretty simple. Is that as soon as you...
Sorry, go back one step on that one as well. Talk about credit expansion and why it happens and why that's a problem. And then...
Oh, sure. Yeah. So that's even simpler. That's basically the essence of what fiat money is and why it's so problematic. That and you can kind of get a sense of this too, of why it's even called fiat money is like, by command, you're just ordered to accept that this is money. All fiat money comes into existence by commercial banks making loans, with the exception of central bank reserves. And the way that this is a little simplified, but again, trying to reach an audience with minimal jargon. The primary function of central bank reserves, or at least the creation of central bank reserves, is to basically give a kind of a moral hazard to commercial banks such that they can't ever actually fail. Because, this is where I was going to go before. Sorry, this is the train of thought that I wanted to pick up on a minute or two ago. I actually think that, so whether it's Keir Starmer or whoever, probably most of the people, not even politicians necessarily, civil servants who are somewhat responsible for this, I honestly don't think that they fully understand most of what I'm talking about right now. And they make a really key conflation, which
That's crazy, man, though.
Well, yeah, but such is life. They make a really key conflation, which is that because we've got to a point with fiat money, in part for economic reasons, I think probably more so for technological reasons. Lynn Alden would be a great person to talk to about this, by the way. She's considerably more kind of erudite on this than I am, or just read Broken Money, which is fantastic. So partly economic reasons, but partly the technological reason of electronic communications being significantly more efficient for making payments than like moving gold around or whatever, right? That's kind of simplified version, but it captures most of it. The conflation that, those in power, for lack of a better way of describing their role, the conflation they have is that because basically all money exists in that form now, and the banking system is necessary to facilitate payments, it can't be tampered with. And this is basically where too big to fail comes from, because what happens if a bank fails? Nobody can move money anymore. And not to mention people's savings are eviscerated, but it's really more the point that like commerce can't function because there is no money outside of banks, right? And so this is a relatively new historical phenomenon. This, at least to the extent that we have it now, has not really been the case for that long, and it's a very, I can't think of a better way of putting it, it's a very insidious conflation to have, because where it leads them is, well, actually anything that happens with it, any harm that the banks or the financial system at large does is okay because they're crucial in this other respect, which is kind of true. They are crucial. It would be a complete, so this is getting to the point about what happens if you try to unwind the credit bubble, but they are completely essential for payments and hence for commerce. But there's no a priori, I guess, reason why that should have anything to do with savings or politics, or they've kind of weaseled themselves into this position of it being basically correct. Yes, they're too big to fail, but there's a good, this is a really good one for kind of diffusing political tension again, because I'm pretty sure this comes from Bernie Sanders, is that too big to fail is too big to exist, which he obviously thinks that for completely different reasons than why I do, but I agree with that.
Can I try and summarize your point? Mm-hmm. What I think you're saying is that society now functions on digital money.
Yes, that's a key part of it.
So this table we bought for this room was a digital payment online. When I bought my train tickets this morning, that was a digital payment. The coffees we bought were a digital payment. If you suddenly lost digital payments, if the financial system broke or the banking system broke, society would collapse very quickly into and the pretty serious civil unrest. So we need the banks to be able to operate so people have access to money. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that the banks themselves have been able to grow by expanding the credit supply to a point where we can't now rein it in. Is that?
Yes. So, well, it's a combination. This is why I'm calling it a conflation, like a particularly insidious conflation, that intermediating savings and investment is one financial function and facilitating payments is another. And so the problem is that not only have they been combined, but the intermediating saving and investment is so completely distorted by fiat. So the payment thing isn't really a fiat thing. The payment thing is more about money being digital to the way you...
It's just communication.
And this is what Lynn explains really well. The intermediation of savings and investment is what has been completely destroyed by fiat incentives. And actually Lynn does a good job explaining this too, that the nature of fiat is to be untethered from any physical reality, and hence there's no, it's the Jeff quote, right? That it's just not remotely scarce anymore, and so then we have all these other downstream problems, whatever. What's particularly insidious is that these roles have been combined such that you can't maybe can't's a bit strong. It's kind of a political question, I guess, but it's very difficult, if not basically impossible, to rein in credit creation, because that would severely harm the banks that rely on it, and that would destroy payments. And so that's the situation that we have now, and why basically nothing can be done about it.
And then can you, I think for people who don't, because there'll be a lot of people listening who don't understand, what do you mean by credit creation?
Oh yeah, sorry, I got distracted before you.
We've really talked about fractional reserve banking.
Not just fractional reserve, but the combination of all these components. So fractional reserve on its own, this might be a bit controversial for Bitcoiners, I don't know, but at least historically, isn't in and of itself necessarily a bad thing. There's very lively, even within people who consider themselves kind of Austrian, right? There's a discourse on this as to many different positions you can take as to like, to what extent is it fraud? To what extent is it like, how should you even analyze it? Fractional reserve on its own, though, I would argue, just for simplicity's sake, to kind of move this conversation along, if it is in a free market, so as in if anyone is free to offer it and they just have to compete, right? And if it's allowed to fail, isn't necessarily that bad a thing. This is basically
is that because
Selden's
assets
thesis.
And liabilities match?
No, it's more just that it's in the situation I just described, the consequence of that setup is that you're not socializing losses. You're completely privatizing losses, right? If the bank fails, then their equity holders get wiped out first, and then every depositor has to take a haircut. But there's other background circumstances that you would kind of assume. If you're talking about fractional reserve in a historical context, you basically don't have that conflation I described, right? You're talking about it as a savings and investment intermediation. There's not necessarily any assumption of there also being payment functionality bundled together with that. So the point I'm making here is just, it's not only fractional reserve. It's a couple of things. It is fractional reserve, but it's fractional reserve in combination with central banking. So this is the link I touched on before. I didn't explain it in that much detail though. So the way that fractional reserve becomes dangerous is when they cartelize and into a central banking entity, which does in fact socialize the losses.
Mean?
So this is basically historically how almost every central bank has come about. Fractional reserve banks, which are at risk of failing, exert enough, they become important enough politically as well as economically that they basically earn the right to print money. And this is how fiat even comes about in the first place, historically. That the role of the central bank is, there's a different, it's probably not worth going into how they set interest rates. It's kind of tangential to this, but the primary role is the ability to create reserves, which even that is like stupid jargon for just printing money, right? Is the ability to recapitalize fractional reserve banks that have failed basically because they're fractional reserve, right?
Right. So a bank fails, but the losses aren't realized because they print money to protect the bank.
Yeah.
And that means an injection of new money into the system.
Yes. So that's one of the two ways that fiat money is created. One is by, again, it's even thinking about it now, the jargon is quite funny because it's all supposed to just distract you, right? It all sounds very technical, but it's just making new money. It's just stealing purchasing power. But yeah, creating excess central bank reserves, that's one way. The main way, though, is commercial banks making loans in the first place. That's where the vast majority of money comes from. So back to the fractional reserve point, historically, that wouldn't necessarily be that bad. It could be bad, but if the risk is properly borne by the people running the bank and the depositors choosing to use the bank rather than having to, because otherwise you can't access payments, right? If you have all of these, what would you call it? Like forces that create a balance of discipline within the entity, then you could argue that it's not such a bad thing. Even if you dislike fractional reserve, which I do, I'm just trying to give some credit and like not be too conspiratorial. The problem is that when you combine all of these factors, what you get is the central bank creating the moral hazard of, it actually doesn't matter if you make bad loans, right? So the consequence of that is they make many, many, many loans, like well above what the market would actually, well above what savers are willing to provide funds for, right? Considerably more loans are made, which is inflation, right? Because that's what fiat money is, more money created. And the main reason that happens is because there's all of the, what I described, what did I say? It was like forces of discipline or something like that have been removed, because if you fail, the central bank saves you because there's no cost to printing this money. And then the final component, just to tie all this together, is that as horrible as that is, because it's just endless inflation forever, you can't risk it failing. I mean, it kind of can't fail because of the central bank component anyway, but you can't risk it even temporarily failing because all payments run through it.
Right. Okay.
So that's the horrible cocktail that we've ended up with.
So I'm going to try and summarize it. Is that banks, your high street bank creates loans. And at the point they create a loan, they are essentially creating money out of thin air.
Yep.
But they do that as a percentage based on their reserves, usually, historically.
Yeah, that can vary, but for the most part, yeah.
Yeah, and they have a risk tolerance, knowing there's a...
Oh, can I interject just very quickly, though, to make a point about this? So historically, with it in the maybe not perfect, but better, let's say, context of fractional reserve banking, that reserve ratio would be determined by prudent management, basically, risk tolerance as to how well they think their loans are performing, how imminent they believe their liabilities to be. Right. And if they got it wrong, they would fail and all their wealth would disappear. In the current system, this is entirely a political calculation. It has nothing to do with economic reality. It's basically how much do we want to stimulate the economy. Okay. And it goes back to the point you were making before about interest rates. And like today, it's just, they can't go higher than like 2% or something because everything will implode.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. It's a tough pill, knowing the Earth is better without us. But imagine if instead, we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
Okay, so the banks can loan money, and they can do that based on their reserves. There's a reserve ratio, and that is essentially a risk tolerance the bank can afford.
Well, I mean, today, not really. Like historically, yes.
I'm saying this is what it should be.
What it should be. Yeah, of course, yeah.
So there's a risk tolerance they can have.
Well, I mean, ideally, they'd just be fully reserved. But anyway,
yeah,
that's not going to happen in fiat.
And so the banks can loan money based on that. And then if the banks were completely independent, we would all have a better understanding of which banks are the best, which are taking more risk, and we could choose to put our money with those banks based on that, and maybe distribute amongst multiple banks. And therefore, when a bank fails, I may lose my money because I took a risk with that bank, and so be it. There's a correction based on that.
And can I add one thing to this?
Yep.
So what would be even better, but for technological reasons is probably impossible, is if payments functionality was completely disintermediated from this. So if the decision that you just described was on the basis of wanting a very modest interest return on your savings, as opposed to because if you don't do it, you basically don't have money.
Okay, that's fair. So if you had your Visa and MasterCard completely independent on this, you could still access the financial system, is what you're saying.
That would be good. Yes, if that were technologically possible, that would be ideal.
But the primary issue we have right now is that historically when banks have failed, it has caused upset, concern with those who have their monies deposited with the accounts. It's therefore a political problem. But there's also considered a wider risk to the economy. And so central banks were introduced as a stabilizing force.
Yeah.
But bear with me. That they're introduced ideally as a stabilizing force to protect those bank and those bank deposits. But in doing so, what they've done is they've acted like an insurance, a free insurance, and therefore banks can take more risk, and the banks will take more risk because they want to make more money for their shareholders and they want to earn higher money. So the incentives are screwed. But I always think a good, if you analogize it to your own life, I earn X, therefore I borrow this much from my house and this much from my car, and I can afford that. I don't get stupid amounts of debt because I don't want to take the risk because my life will collapse. There's no backup. But if I always knew Dad was there, if Dad was my central bank, I would possibly take more risk because I know if I screw up, Dad will pay me. So I don't learn. I think it's
slightly. I obviously I agree with this. I know what you're getting at. Can I tweak that just slightly? It's not your dad. It's all of your neighbors.
Yeah,
that's the difference.
No. Yeah. So but my dad protects me by taking the money from all my neighbors. Yeah, but the point being is, like, the best thing a rich parent can do is make their kid get a job and learn about money because you learn about financial discipline. If a rich dad doesn't force their kids to get a job or don't teach them financial discipline, they become financially irresponsible.
And this is basically what's happened with everybody rather than just one family.
And therefore, the central banks have become a tool of politics, really.
Yeah. Oh, they're completely political,
to be a stabilizing force for the economy, but really it's short-term stabilization, long-term inflation.
That's a very good way of putting it. That they they basically, this is why I was getting kind of worked up when you were saying they're for stability's sake or whatever. They're basically, they avoid any short-term stress by consistently making the long-term worse. And there's a really good analogy for this. I mentioned bringing this up earlier. I think we just moved on before I find a way to work it in. Very good analogy for this, which won't sound completely serious, but I think honestly works surprisingly well, which is hangovers, right? So what I mean by this is that the best way, if you're, I don't know that you'd be like an alcoholic necessarily, but if you've been drinking a lot, right? The best way to get healthy again is to take the hit of having a hangover, right? And like drink a lot of water and go for a run or whatever, like have a sauna, something like that, right? It's very much not to keep drinking. You can do that. Like you can keep drinking and it's the hair of the dog, right? There's an expression for this. You postpone a hangover by not stopping drinking. And in the short run, that will always feel better. But in the long run, you'll die. So it's very similar.
Okay. So because there's so many things I just don't think the general public understand.
I totally don't understand this, yeah.
I even think a lot of people don't even understand the idea of preserving purchasing power. And this is why I think inflation, even low inflation, is so insidious. If we hadn't had this recent 10, 15% inflation, we just sat there somewhere between 1.5% and 2.5% for 20, 30 years. Most people would have saved away, grown their savings, perhaps not really thought too much about it, not realizing that they've got way less purchasing power at the end of it than they could have had because they've had this kind of like inflation eating away at them. And certainly in a world where their interest rate is below their the inflation rate, they're actually losing purchasing power. And so
they're forced into speculative assets instead.
Yeah, and it becomes this thing where, you've mentioned it before, and I've seen it with my own eyes. When I went to Argentina, there was this thing that was said to me. We went out to dinner, 4 of us having dinner, and we were talking about money, and they were saying, this guy said, I essentially have 2 jobs. I have my day job, and then I have my financial job. And my financial job is to take my, for context for people listening, this is a country that's living under high double-digit inflation and has had bouts of hyperinflation. He said, I take my pesos, and I very quickly get rid of them instantly, as fast as possible, and I try and get dollars or equities. Yeah, and it's only something that the middle class and the elites in Argentina can access. And he said, that's 30% of my time. And the guy said to me, yeah, it's me as well. And the other guy said, look, we're all financial directors here. It feels like that's coming to the UK. It feels like it's coming. I am now starting to think like that a lot. Yeah. And it's, like not as a person who's thinking, how do I invest my money to grow my money? That's historically how I thought. Over the last few years, I've started to think, how do I defend my purchasing power? Yeah. And I don't think a purchasing power is a thing still, even with the recent high inflation, a lot of people are thinking about.
Yeah. And this is one of the, I think, really insidious social consequences too, that's very tricky to pin down because it's so completely intangible. But everything you've just described, whether it's those guys in Argentina or whoever has to start dealing with this in the UK, like what a ridiculous waste of time. Yeah. Like these are productive people, they would otherwise be productive people. And this is what they're having to spend their time on. Like you can't really put a number on that, but you can, especially if you've lived it or you've spoken to people who have lived it, it does kind of smack you in the face how stupid it is.
Well, it's a misallocation of human capital.
Yeah, exactly. It's very well put.
You can use that one. Wow, that was a long intro.
But so, on to part 1.
Well, yeah, no, but this savings point is super interesting. It has created this short-termism, and like I say, I think it's creating this impending pension crisis, impending retirement crisis. I think there are people who just won't be retiring. Yeah. They just won't have an ability to retire. I don't think their state pension is going to cover what they need. And I think a lot of people were possibly thinking, well, my house is my pension.
I think probably, I'm not the expert on political analysis of this, but what you're describing seems so likely to be so extreme that I don't mind venturing a guess. That will have to be inflated away. That is not politically tolerable to just have pensioners starving.
So Luke Wyman said, yeah. Is there one more part of this? We talked about the banks creating money, and we talked about the fact that the central bank will step in and always protect them. Do we need to talk about the financial engineering as well, which creates all this leverage in the system in that I have an asset, I can loan against that asset, and which essentially was the 2008 crisis in some ways. Can you explain that part of? I think it goes back to. Do you remember that drawing you did?
Oh yeah, yeah, the fiat financial stack.
Yeah, which basically looks like. Is it Mr. Silly?
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you got it?
I can probably find it.
Oh yeah, let's stick it up.
What would I search to find that, Alan?
Oh, good question. I think I tweeted it with no caption, unfortunately, so I'm not sure.
I'll try.
Maybe fiat financial stack, but I think I wrote that on the paper rather than in the tweet. I'm not. Yeah, I don't know.
All right, we'll see if we can find it.
Yeah.
But so hopefully the people listening will have a little bit of understanding about, if they didn't know how banks work, know a little bit about how banks work, then they'll know a little bit about how central banks work and those losses are being socialized. But this financial system, this financial engineering, which to me really is another cancer within the system.
Yeah. So this is interesting. I actually have. I think maybe it seems to annoy you more than it annoys me.
It annoys me in a fiat system.
Yeah.
Whereby things are not allowed to fail.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. That's obviously objectionable.
I have no idea with people being clever with finance, creating securities. I have no issue with people, creating financial systems. I have an issue with it in a system whereby the entire financial system collapses pretty much in 2008 and nobody goes to jail. Yeah, that's where I have an issue with.
Which I think is a political problem more than economic. I mean, the point I was going to make is that there's a similar issue with, how people communicate the word and the concept capitalism, I think, with financial engineering. Obviously, it's more kind of niche. It is in itself a little bit jargony. I don't have any issue at all with financial engineering. I think for the most part, in the abstract, right, context free, I think for the most part, it's likely to be socially useful, even if in a very indirect way that most people don't directly notice, provided, very similar discussion to fractional reserve banks then morphing into fiat and central banking, provided the losses are kept private, right? Provided that the appropriate forces of discipline are there and they can't socialize the losses, and they maybe even more intangibly, they can't amass political power to even get in a position to socialize the losses and so on and so forth. So financial engineering on its own, I don't necessarily have a problem with. I think what you're getting at though is that within fiat finance, because it's very difficult to save, because that forces the monetization of securities. It basically forces, this is kind of amusing to use this expression in this context. I think Bitcoiners will associate it more with like crypto shenanigans, but it forces yield chasing, right? Like that's ultimately where all this comes from. So I think people can look at, the kind of things that happen in the financial crisis of like securitizations and think it's kind of insane and maybe even like borderline offensive, right? I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because if those what's offensive about it is that the people who took the risks did not suffer the losses. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that you can securitize a security of a security. Like if you want to do that, fine, provided you're taking the risks and you're managing. It's the same with like a fractional reserve bank, right? I don't necessarily have a problem with that if it's being done prudently and the people have skin in the game. Basically, that's a nice way of capturing that. But the way it comes about in fiat finance and what does become very objectionable and even kind of disgusting, offensive, and so on, is that it doesn't exist really because it's a good idea or because it's smart or because it's useful. It exists as ever more desperate forms of chasing yield. Again, ultimately because you have to do that to try to preserve your purchasing power, right? It's like the slippery slope from you should be able to save. It's not really saving, then it's not really investment either. It's really just speculation. And it's kind of nudging in that direction by ever more ridiculous means. I think actually there's a final component worth mentioning, which is probably what you had in mind too, that the obvious way, especially the more politically connected you are, the obvious way to affect this is via leverage as well. So it's not just that they're ridiculous in their construction, it's that they're causing, or they're contributing to causing the problem that they're a reaction to try to solve, right? So the problem is caused by endless credit creation. And this particular means of trying to address that involves creating more credit.
I particularly have a disdain for when it happens on close to zero interest rates and people are able, venture capital firms are able to create funds, very large, maybe even multi-billion-dollar funds based on 0% interest rates and invest that money. They're essentially getting to invest for free, other people's money for free, and build companies up, which they now float at a point where they are socializing the profits they've gained into a stock market.
Yeah, I agree.
This is
I don't
something
even have anything to add. It's just like, yes.
This is, I think, along the lines of something you've said to us before, which I don't know if I fully understand, which is where you've mentioned that these like VC companies invest in businesses, even though they know they're not good investments, but because they've got to put money somewhere.
Yeah, well, it's not, I backtrack a little bit on that. It's not the VCs who are necessarily making that decision. I'm a VC, so I can't, I don't think I do this, but we'll see. I think that for the most part, VCs are probably honest enough in terms of outlining what their thesis is. I think the context we brought this up in last time was as to like why all this crypto shit happens and why it seemingly never goes away.
Yeah.
But obviously you can extend it a bit beyond that. I think if anything, crypto is just the most ridiculous version of this, but it's not completely dissimilar. It's just like further down the curve of stupidity and yield chasing actually too. Even for them though, frankly, I would like to think at least that the VCs are being fairly transparent about what it is they're trying to do. The problem is that those allocating capital to them, which is ultimately pension funds for the most part, so that goes back to that problem too, they don't really have much of a choice because they know what their liabilities are, right? They know what their liabilities are. They know what their assets are. They know they have a mismatch. They know it's literally not possible to close that gap via anything less risky than whatever it is they're considering. And so they're forced down this risk curve, again, ultimately just to keep up with inflation. Or keep up with attempting to preserve the purchasing power of their beneficiaries. They're forced to invest in basically dumber and dumber things in the hope that it gets so out there on the risk curve that, one of them 1,000x's and they're magically saved. Because they know they can't close the gap with like real estate anymore.
So this just gets more and more ridiculous until they're buying lottery tickets or something.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
But
they all get paid as well. Don't forget that. They get management fees on this.
2 and 20.
Yeah.
Okay, so for those who are anti-capitalist or think we are in a true capitalist system, what would proper capitalism look like? So have we tried proper capitalism?
I find it very difficult to articulate this positively in the sense of, to my mind, it's just stripping things away. It's like, I don't know what it will look like necessarily. I just know what it won't look like. And what I think is that for the most part, most of current finance will disappear. Not overnight. I don't think you'll just like wake up and be like, oh shit, it's all gone now. Now we're on a Bitcoin standard. Hooray. I don't think it'll happen like that at all. I mean, it could take like 50, 100 years or whatever. And maybe it never happens, right? Maybe Bitcoin fails. Like you got to throw that out there too. But I think that the way you're most likely to see it happen is people so the beneficiaries, basically, people at the source of providing this capital in the first place, saving with Bitcoin. Rather than, so realizing they can't save with fiat, but not contributing to the monetization of other assets via their pension schemes or some other financial intermediation, and just doing it in Bitcoin instead. And hence the financial intermediaries gradually lose customers over time because nobody values that service anymore.
I think the question you've answered is how do we destroy this fiat system?
Oh no,
and create a new
not
system?
Really, because I don't think any of us can influence this. I think it's inevitable. I think this just happens on its own. And the consequence is there is still financial intermediation. So I've kind of alluded to this a couple of times in saying like, I don't mind financial engineering. I think, brokering, saving, and investment is very useful. Like this is basically my key kind of pushback on the socialist attack of like finance is very valuable if done properly. Problem is fiat makes it done highly improperly, right? So finance will still exist. It'll just be considerably smaller and less politically influential and less entangled in every other industry than it is now.
Okay.
I think that's the simplest answer.
Yeah. I still don't think it answers the question, but I understand why you've answered it that way. Let me go a different way. Did we have a capitalist system under the gold standard?
Oh, so, well, I don't think you can really give a simple yes or no to that. So this is going right back to when Danny was asking, what do I even mean by capitalism?
Closer.
Oh, definitely closer. Yes, clearly closer. But only that's kind of circular. Or my answer to this is kind of circular because that's how I'm defining what it is I think is valuable about capitalism in the first place, right? It's promoting capitalistic tendencies via saving and investment as opposed to fiat consumption and hedonism and so on. So it's kind of a non-answer. It's like, well, by definition, yes, based on the definition I gave you.
Okay. So then probably the question is what is it about Bitcoin that would create a more capitalist system than we have under fiat?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I think we've covered a lot of ground to make this relatively simple. So one is it naturally both disintermediates payments from brokering, saving, and investment, right? They're completely separate. So the payments is part of the protocol, right? Whereas the financial intermediation is still its own thing, its own industry potentially. Even more so than that, though, it disintermediates components of that because you no longer need an intermediary in order to simply store your money. I think that's probably the key component. That's probably, in my mind at least, what contributes the most to reducing the size and sprawl of finance. That I'm kind of dancing around saying decentralization. I don't really like saying that because it's a bit ethereal, right? But in practice, I think this is how decentralization is achieved, that there's more individuals can do directly with their own money without requiring an intermediary. That's the difference Bitcoin makes.
You are separating...
As well as the soundness. That's another thing we can obviously get into, but that's kind of beaten to death, I guess.
They're going to be very large concepts for someone for the first time hearing it to get their head around. So what you're really saying is rather than having banks as custodians of your money, issuers of money, and transmitters of money, that is now going out to a peer-to-peer network. So you are now can be the custodian of your own money.
I think the easier way to understand that, even rather than focusing on Bitcoin, it's more to get clear in your own mind how fiat works in this way, in the sense that there almost isn't such a thing as fiat money other than as a bank liability, right? We kind of touched this before because there's some overlap with digitization here. The most money is now digital. But even if you have cash, which, I mean, cash is like hardly anybody uses cash anymore. You should, though, just to throw that in. It's pro-social anonymity properties, but it doesn't really help this broader problem that I'm talking about because it's fiat. Basically, it's only has value in the sense that it represents a bank liability, right? In a very kind of almost literal physical sense, you can go to a bank, give them the note, and they'll top up your balance. And that's really the digital balance is really what you want. And I think this, if anything, Bitcoin's actually quite simple compared to this. I think it's getting clear on how this works and how misleading it all is. And just kind of thinking through like, okay, what would it mean for me to actually hold money myself and to not have to rely on a bank? And you quickly realize you just can't do it. Like, maybe not can't, but like you could do it, but your life would be unbearable. You wouldn't be able to pay for anything, basically, or you'd be able to pay for very little, and it'd be awful. So it's kind of untangling that is what Bitcoin does.
So we probably need to work through that one step at a time because there's a few key components that we don't need to explain the technical details of how Bitcoin works. But I think a good starting point would be what Bitcoin does different from fiat in terms of credit creation.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
Because-
well, that's super simple. That it's
stopping the expansion of the money supply. Because if we stop the expansion of the money supply, we don't have inflation.
Yeah. So one thing to get super clear on is you can obviously have credit on Bitcoin. You can have loans denominated in Bitcoin. People can do that.
You can loan me money.
Sure. Yeah. You could even do it synthetically in the sense of you could make a loan that. Let me just think. I don't want this to get too jargony. You could. Actually, people argue exchanges do this interestingly. So this is a good point to jump on. If you have a balance of Bitcoin at an exchange rather than in your own custody, as far as you know, it's really an IOU on Bitcoin. Like you'll have covered this to death on previous podcasts, right? You could argue, I mean, if it's fully reserved, that's fine. This is like its own whole topic of discussion that I'm absolutely not the expert in, but like proof of reserves and proof of liabilities and so on. If those balances are fully reserved, then I guess it's fine. I mean, it's still preferable to have it in self-custody, obviously, but economically, it's not too different. If it's not fully reserved, then that's a form of credit, right? That's Bitcoin credit. It doesn't need to be like me loaning you Bitcoin. It can arrive. That's what I meant by like it can arise synthetically. The difference, though, is that you can't. You can compare them, but you have to recognize how this is going to play out very differently from, for example, an originally fractional reserve fiat bank, because nobody can print more Bitcoin to save them.
Yes.
And that's what's really exciting about it. So it's impossible to avoid what I was describing before as like these pressures of discipline and prudent management and so on. And you get quite quickly, I think. So this is exactly what the last time I was on the previous podcast with Eric, this is what we're talking about, because we just written a paper basically about this, that it's reasonable to think that given the ability for people to withdraw, given that if anything, it's kind of a more natural state for people to custody Bitcoin themselves rather than hold it with an exchange, that pressure, or any financial institution, let's say, like this could be 50 years in the future where there isn't even such thing as a Bitcoin exchange anymore because everyone uses Bitcoin. The pressure of being able to withdraw and knowing you can't get bailed out probably pushes every institution providing that service to full reserve, because it's just insanely risky not to, because you can't socialize the losses. The losses will all be privatized. And if there's even this is all speculative, by the way, just to be clear, but I think it's the reasoning stands up pretty well. If there's any suggestion whatsoever that some of the customers will bear the losses, you just have a bank run and it's self-fulfilling immediately.
I think there's a good way we could almost show the two scenarios. So Danny is Bank of Fiat, holds his deposit for his customers.
Yeah.
I'm the Bitcoin exchange, essentially, let's call it a Bitcoin bank. We don't know either reserves. A bunch of people keep their fiat with Danny's bank. A bunch of people keep their Bitcoin with me. And we're both not fully reserved. We both haven't got he hasn't got enough fiat to cover all his customers. Yeah. I don't have, for whatever reason, enough Bitcoin for all my customers. There are whispers that we're both in trouble.
Yep.
So all Danny's customers suddenly do what is a run on the bank. They go and try and withdraw their money. Danny can't meet those customers' deposits. He can't provide them. He eventually closes his bank. He stops people withdrawing money. And there are a bunch of customers who don't have any money anymore. But Danny calls up the Bank of England.
Central Bank of Ireland.
The Central Bank of Ireland. And they recapitalize his bank. And suddenly all his customers get their money back. And we've increased the money supply, which leads to inflation and all those insidious things that come of it. Whispers come on mine. I try and issue people their Bitcoin back. I don't have enough of Bitcoin to cover everyone. There's no bank. I can't phone up Bank of Ireland and get more Bitcoin in. Those losses are borne by my customers who took the risk of being with me.
Yeah.
That's the two systems.
Yep. Mm-hmm. There's another point that's actually, you can push this even further. And I realized before when I was talking about the conflation of brokering, saving, and investment and payments, right? This is like what has happened with fiat. There's yet another component that is almost, I think with fiat, it's kind of, I don't know, almost too simple to treat properly, other than when you then get to compare it with Bitcoin and it becomes a lot more interesting, which is what the point of being a custodian is in the first place, and in particular disintermediating that's not quite right, just separating, like conceptually separating custodianship and investment brokerage. So, for example, if Coinbase, I guess, if Coinbase were not fully reserved, well, so one way that Coinbase could not be fully reserved with their Bitcoin could be, other than just like they're lying and it's paper Bitcoin or whatever, and they've like embezzled it. They could have tried to invest the Bitcoin to get a return. And then you can immediately see the historical comparison to the slippery slope of like how you end up with Bank of Danny rather than the Bitcoin bank, because they're getting the money for free effectively because they're custodying it for you. They could try to invest it and then capture that spread. And that is basically how fiat banks, like that's the fiat business model. In fiat, you don't really think so much about that because, of course, like what else is a bank doing? Like people use it to custody their money. And as we mentioned a couple of minutes ago, you kind of don't have money really unless it's custodied with a bank. But they're also doing this investment. And obviously investing is risky. And then the losses get socialized, etc. This, however, is what happened with FTX, more or less. I mean, there's a lot more shenanigans involved in that. But very simply, they were not fully reserved because they were trying to invest it and catch the spread for themselves. And the investments went south and the whole thing collapsed because no one can print more Bitcoin for them.
This could lead to a reshaping of what banks are or these custodians are. Because I'll be honest, I would much rather a bank said to me, here's your cash. We're going to put it in a segregated account and it's protected. We're not going to invest it, but we're going to charge you £50, £100 a month for your bank account service. I'd like to have that service. That's
probably what will happen,
Yeah, and so that's where I see kind of like what maybe Caitlin Long's been trying to do with custodians, the kind of service I want. Which did exist
hundreds of years ago. This is basically where banks actually come from, is providing this service.
Yeah.
But the tricky thing is, as soon as you, we've kind of covered this already. I won't labor this point, but as soon as you move away from not only the money being sound, but I think the key thing that holds all of this together for Bitcoin is that you actually can custody Bitcoin on your own, and it doesn't make the experience any worse. You're not locking yourself out the payment network. If anything, you're improving your access to the payment network by doing it yourself.
Well, we should explain what that means, again, for people who don't know. But with Bitcoin, I don't have to leave an exchange. I can store it on my phone, in a hardware wallet. There's various wallets I can be my own bank, that term that people would have heard. And by being my own bank, I can also transact with that money.
Yes.
Because it's a decentralized network that doesn't rely on any one third party for me to be able to send you Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And I think that's a shift that there's like I think these are monumental shifts
definitely,
that people have to go through. It's like you don't need to have a bank, and you don't need to have a central bank, and you don't need to have an issuer of money.
Yeah.
It is all independent and it freely works. But you have to get used to a few things. If you fuck up, you're losing your money. Yeah. And there is no insurance. There's no one here to save you.
Which is perfectly natural, though. That's what I think is kind of weird about this. I mean, I know we're all familiar with it, but I don't know about you, but I do occasionally find this frustrating when trying to like orange pill people, say, right? That I've thought this for a long time. I've given talks around more or less this topic, that all of these, if you strip away the finance component, you strip away the technology component, if you think of it as just like social, lessons, let's say, everything that follows from how you ought to use Bitcoin, and even you can extend it further to like, what will the financial system look like, right? But these are very old principles. This is just like received wisdom for most people. You were even mentioning before, like I think we moved on before we really dug into it, but thinking back to when you were a kid and it was far more established for people to have savings.
Yeah.
That's normal. The fact that that's been like strip mined away and now it's normal to just have revolving credit card debt, that's toxic. That's horrible. So it's whenever I find the opportunity, and I find it really difficult, like I don't think I'm even particularly good at communicating this, I think because I like getting bogged down in all the like intellectual intricacies, but whenever I can try to make the case that it's actually fiat that's so weird and convoluted, and Bitcoin is just, not only is it simple, again, maybe that's more a technological point, but socially it aligns with how would you even put it, beliefs, I guess. It aligns with things that people probably do believe and do recognize as not in any way new and innovative and scary, but really old, like really, really old and tested. And in whatever way I can try to communicate that, I like to.
Well, but that's the thing. I think the principles of Bitcoin are quite simple. The technology is complicated because it needs to be. We're trying to create a global financial system which is outside of government reach and influence.
Yeah.
It's a tricky thing.
Hard.
Technically, it's challenging, but we've managed it. But the principles are simple. I've got a tweet out there that says, I need Bitcoin to do 3 things for me. I need to be able to hold it, send it, and receive it.
Yep.
and the only kind of like addition to that is I need ways to send it and receive it quicker sometimes. But, But it does that.
It reminds me of you might be able to dig this up, Daddy, as well, actually. But I had this really funny exchange on Twitter a long, long time ago where me and Gigi were basically trolling. What's his name? Paul Graham, right?
Yeah.
Who I do like for the most part. Like I don't need to get into that. Like some things he says are insane, but his essays are very good. I forget what it was he even said in the first place, but he said some kind of not terribly insightful, think boyish thing about Bitcoin, like trying to philosophize on what's good about it. And then me and Gigi were just going back and forth in the replies, sort of trolling him on the basis of it's what's good about it is, or what needs to work about Bitcoin, really, like its core functionality is what Gigi called it sendiness, right? So it's like maximally, and then this was my contribution was chipping in saying, oh yeah, it's maximally sendy for sure. But I think we're kind of getting at the same thing, right? It's like, in terms of, obviously how it actually works is incredibly complicated and freaks people out the first time they hear it. And then obviously I like to bring up a lot, Jameson Lopp has the article, nobody understands Bitcoin, and that's okay. Like you have that component to it as well. But in terms of how you should expect to use it, you just send it.
Well, I think
you either send it or you don't send it, and both of those are fine.
I think of it as, there's another weird way of putting it, but I think of it as money for grown-ups.
That's good.
And the reason I think that is it's mature money, because I think the fiat system is money wrapped in cotton wool. Again, I go back to the parental analogy. Like at some point, you have to send your kids off and say, you're on your fucking own. I did it to my son, sent him off to Kenya. I was like, go get your shit together. You're on your own. And he did. He had to be responsible on his own. And for money, I think, in a world where we rely on the banks and we trust the banks and please look after us, and if I make a mistake, make sure it's there. That is a world wrapped in cotton wool. When you get into the world of Bitcoin and you are custodying it yourself, and you have to go down that kind of rabbit hole, understanding money, wealth, assets. You're essentially becoming a grown up with money.
Yep.
And
I agree.
And there's not a single person I know in Bitcoin who's done that, who hasn't come out the back end of that more mature, better understanding money, in a better financial position. Also has
typically happier too.
Happier. Also
more optimistic about life.
Yeah, and they also have I think they have a better critical eye on what's happening in the world right now, because there is this social decay, and I personally think it's all linked. Yeah. So it's money for grown-ups.
I think you might like this too, that we've used the phrase socialized losses a couple of times, which is fairly financial, I guess. It's like kind of jargony in that realm. I think it's pretty fair. I'm just thinking of this now, so this might not really land as well as I'm hoping it will, but I think it's fair to give a more of a kind of an ethical interpretation, let's say, than a financial one. Something along the following lines, that if you are not taking, or if one is not taking responsibility, that doesn't make the responsibility disappear. It just means that everyone else has to take it for you.
Yep.
And that's essentially what's happening with socializing losses, right? It's that whoever has actually caused the loss wasn't at the time, but certainly when it comes due, isn't taking responsibility for it. So everyone else is forced to take responsibility for it.
It's very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin. Oh,
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
Is there a weird perverse effect as well? When you socialize the losses, you are in turn socializing gains for the richest in society.
So what do you mean socializing gains?
So sorry, you're privatizing gains.
Oh yeah,
because,
of course, yeah.
Because the process of socializing the losses is leading to inflation, which is increasing the price of the assets of the richest people.
Yes. Yeah.
Definitely. So fucked.
Yeah.
It's so fucked, isn't it?
It's pretty bad. I don't like it.
No, well, funny enough,
I'm not a fan.
Probably everyone at this table benefits from it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, we're all trying to at least communicate out. This is fucking crazy. I think
But that's the thing, though. I mean, you're obviously joking about this, but like, no one's going to be a martyr on it. Like, it would be stupid to impoverish yourself to make a point about this process of impoverishment.
No, I don't intend to do that. What I intend to do, though, is like fight against it in a.
Of course, yeah. No, I'm not arguing against you. I'm arguing against someone who could make this observation as like, oh, you're just all talking your own book. Which I'm sure you've got before.
Well, yes, Eric
You're
Weinstein.
like shilling your own bags, basically.
First time it said to me was Eric Weinstein. He said, with Bitcoin, you're talking your own book. And it was a real reflection moment. I was like, okay, am I? And do I want this to work? Because if Bitcoin works, I'm talking my own book.
Probably, in part.
Potentially, but
you can't avoid that. Like, you're just being honest with yourself. You can't. But I think it's a good thing, though, because I'm sure you know this. This won't be like news to you. But one of the maybe under-celebrated things about Bitcoin, I think in part because it's a delicate issue and it can come across as kind of perverse and ugly, but is actually extremely important, is that it's not purely charitable, right? People who are involved in it are incentivized to be involved in it.
Well, this is what Parker Lewis said to me. So after that Eric Weinstein interview where he said you're talking your book, I did an interview with Parker and I said, I've considered selling all my Bitcoin to give a layer of credibility to what I'm doing, because then I'm promoting what I think is right without any gain. And he said, that's totally the wrong approach. He said, the fact that you own Bitcoin incentivizes you even more to get this message out. If you believe it's right.
I'd be even stronger than that. What I thought you were going to say, Parker said, was actually selling it is harming.
Yeah.
Because if you hold it, and this is going to get like weirdly jargony again, but if you are withholding your supply from the market, you are helping the price. You're kind of intrinsically pumping your own bags. I guess that's kind of true of any asset, but in particular with Bitcoin, because it's sound. Right?
Yeah.
It's the effect is really accentuated with Bitcoin because there is only so much that can be on the market to be priced. And so that's basically what you're doing by saving, right? You're just keeping some portion off the market.
I do think it's going to become easier to explain Bitcoin to people in the shorter term. It's very easy when you're in Venezuela to explain Bitcoin to people. Argentina, it's so easy. Oh, it's money the government can't steal. What? Okay, how the fuck do I get some of that? It's money the government can't inflate away.
We're getting flavors of that, right? Like you've got the trucker protest in Canada. You've got the whole issue with Nigel Farage with, what was it, Coots or NatWest, I think.
Coots, I think it was.
That kicking up a big fuss. I mean, not so. What I really liked about that, again, just to try to like diffuse the potential political tension, is that I think he played that really well because he didn't make it about him. He spun it because he came on the podcast, right? I told you this at the time, like how important I thought that was. He spun his experience into shedding light on like really how many people this happens to and how bad it is. And that, again, this is maybe the kind of thing like just the average person, you stop someone in the street, you ask them like, I don't know, whatever you'd ask people in Venezuela, like does our government confiscate our money or something like that? Probably most of them would say no, but they're wrong. And they're gonna, I think that's what you're saying, right? Pretty soon they're gonna be more cognizant of that possibility.
There is that. There is, if you believe tax is theft, they're going to steal more of your money. This is we just interviewed Anna Chekovich, who ran for the Navalny Anti-Corruption Foundation, and a lot of his policy was built on the fact they're stealing your money, they're stealing your resources, and they're stealing your money. Look, I'm not fully anti-tax, right? I believe a functioning society will have a tax code of some kind. I'm more in the Dominic Frisby camp of there's no point arguing for zero tax or full anarcho-capitalism, because from where we are to there's just, it's illogical. There's no logical path. So let's talk about reduction in tax and let's go on a better trajectory. Like, that's the world I'm in. But when you see governments talking about increasing capital gains tax to 40% from 20 or 22, that is a theft that is a potential theft on what I hold. To not have that money taken, I have to leave and go to another jurisdiction. So these things are problematic. There is, and Navalny's point is they're stealing from you. I think our governments are essentially stealing from us now. I think, but you can't put a point of like what amounts of tax is theft or what amount is But generally speaking, they're stealing. They're just stealing, and I want to get people away from this idea of going, well, fuck the rich. There's some like realities that you have to get your head around. I've bookmarked it. There's a really interesting. Let me read this to you. There's a really interesting thing that happened in Norway. This is something some people have got to get their head around. Where did I bookmark
Is this the wealth tax?
Yeah. So if you want to tax wealth, fine. And if you want to support people, if you believe, government should tax wealthy people more because they're rich, fuck the billionaires. There's realities of this as well. In 2022, Norway increased wealth tax to 1.1%, expecting to bring in an additional 146 million tax revenue. Individuals with a net worth of $54 billion left the country, led to a 559 million loss in tax revenue, a net decrease of 448 million. So taxation is a balancing act.
Yeah. So I think this is where you're going with this anyway. But politics aside, again, in part because I'm not the best, but also in part because I think it's more interesting, for me at least, the point I'm going to make about Bitcoin, to recognize that it's essentially apolitical. Bitcoin makes this so much easier, just as a physical reality, not as a political point. Very, very easy to flee with your Bitcoin.
Yeah, another. I mean, look, it's a whole other conversation. Every other benefit. But I just like this idea of trying to nudge people towards, like you say, apolitically. It benefits everyone.
Yeah,
everyone benefits not everyone. a large amount.
It benefits everyone except the Yuppie elite.
The Yuppie elite who've got a reckoning.
So depending on how much of your time you spend with the Yuppie elite.
But back to that point where it's really easy to explain to people in countries that have got high inflation, high government theft that this is a great tool. I think it's going to get easier here. When the riots happened,
that's sad though, isn't it?
But sometimes it
I know. I mean, it has. I agree. It has to. I'm not looking forward to it.
Again, another reason we've done this show to move it here, to just try and tap into these things, because when I saw the riots kick off recently all across the UK, I don't know, did they reach Scotland?
Not really.
I saw a range of people protesting, from nihilistic kids to certainly people from the right wing to well-articulated middle class people. I saw a lot of scapegoating against migrants and immigrants, which, not to say there isn't an issue. There certainly is a large influx of immigrants into the country. I just don't think that's the primary issue. I think this is a build-up of tension from people who've been financially squeezed over the last few years. Yeah. I think inflation is...
I wouldn't say few years, I'd say decades. And this actually goes back to a point we made, feels like a long time ago now, about the effect of... again, be careful how I communicate it, but financial deregulation, but without any mindfulness of industrial policy as a whole, and with fiat money supporting this process such that the UK economy is increasingly financialized. And one of the points I wanted to get to as a result of that is, I'm sure you know this anyway, or at least it's probably even more powerful if, rather than you knowing the fact of what I'm about to say, you can kind of feel it, like you just know it to be true without needing to see the numbers. But did you know, for example, if you remove London from the UK for statistical purposes, the UK is poorer than every state in the US. It's poorer than the poorest US state.
I'm not surprised. Yeah.
Basically, what's happened in the UK, this is what I was getting at before we kind of moved on into more theoretical territory. What's happened in the UK, I wouldn't say exclusively. This is back to like, fiat's not everything. Fiat's not all of anything, but it is some of everything. What's happened in the UK is that it's basically just become a poor country with a rich city, because everything has been sucked into the orbit of London fiat finance. And that's quite sad to me, because I don't live in London, so and I don't work in fiat finance anymore. So.
I mean, look, I see it. I mean, where I live in a nothing town. There's lots of, like Bedford, there's lots of nothing towns around the country where there's no real industry.
What was Bedford historically? Do you know? What was its industry?
Well, so it's had a few. So London Brick was there, which and we saw a number of Italians migrate to Bedford to work there, and we have a massive Italian community. But we had some big companies. We had Granada was there at one point, and we had Texas Instruments there. We've had a lot, but now it's really it's a commuter town,
right?
So anyone with
the industry's hollowed out.
Yeah, I mean,
basically everywhere.
Yeah, so it's a commuter town. There's a large number of people who commute to London or work remotely for larger companies. And you have a massive build-up of logistics companies around the town.
Right.
Bedford's in this weird place whereby if the two spines of the country, the A1 and the M1, lead Bedford's halfway between them. There's a dual carriageway between the two. So you go, you get on the M1, you go 20, 30 minutes north of London on either of those, you can cross and get to Bedford. So you can get to, Bedford's a good place north of London to get anywhere in the country. Interestingly, I think Bedford is the reason, Bedford's position is the reason we've got Universal Studios coming there. Do you know about this?
No.
Universal Studios are building their first theme park in Europe, I think, in Bedford.
That's awesome.
It's 4 minutes from my house. It is cool. It's going to create a bunch of jobs because you can get a quick train there. You can get from Stansted or Luton Airport. So from Europe easily you can get there. But
it's not all bad.
Well, no, but
we found a non-finance industry.
Well, up until that point, but we've got one of we got a huge Amazon warehouse, but all we've got is basically loads of these warehouses popping up. You know what they look like, where they've got the lorry ports at the back where they fill them up. And I've been up there. I've been up to the Amazon one. It's fucking depressing. You go up there,
it looks cathedral,
dude. It looks like a fucking. It looks like a fucking prison. Yeah. They've got these huge gates on the way in and out. I know the people in there are probably miserable. I know Amazon don't treat their staff particularly well. I know they have don't they have timed toilet breaks and some people live in tents? I've seen this kind of stuff. There's a really good film. It's the director who made Nomadland. I think that film pictures the depressing nature of an Amazon warehouse particularly well. Okay. There's a woman nearing retirement, and she goes, "Well, it's just fucking shit. It sucks." But that's what it's been hollowed out. And industry in the town centre, as somebody trying to build companies there, I see how hard it is because you are trapped. You've got business rates, you've got ever-growing employment laws, which I'm not an evil person, but a lot of these employment laws make it very difficult to build a business. If you want flexible workers who are happy, historically, people were happy to have a second job in a bar or a cafe to top up their income, But by giving them exactly the same employment rights as everyone else, again, it's designed to help them, but what it does, it makes it harder to grow a business. Yeah. And so it's very hard with business rates, employment law, taxation, licensing, all those things. Very hard to create a small business in the town.
Well, you mentioned this a long time ago in this discussion, right? That I think in a slightly different context, but I'm pretty sure the same point, that it's very frustrating trying to debate these topics with socialists or leftists, more broadly speaking, because by and large, it seems like they don't understand that these policies are hurting the people they're intending to help.
Yeah. I mean,
it's a frustration of mine too. It's more in a slightly more less practical way, but it's something I whine about on Twitter a lot and argue with fiat economists about, which I think you'll agree with perfectly, just given your experience, right? That I get kind of bugged by, this is going to sound really, really niche, but you'll see where I'm going with it. I get bugged by discourse around so-called unemployment on the basis that unemployment isn't what's interesting. Employment is what's interesting. Unemployment is the natural state of things. I don't mean to sound too Randian or anything, but without capitalists making returns that require labor inputs, there is no employment.
Yes.
And so that's, I mean, obviously, if you say that to one of the people we were talking about before, then they're probably not going to take it very seriously. They probably don't even know what most of it means. But nonetheless, it's true, right? And actually, there's something really interesting I found out. I think it was Safe who told me this, or maybe I just saw it in a tweet of Safe's or something, but I verified it independently that if you do Google Ngram, where it's like you see the frequency of words in publications across time.
Yep.
You do unemployment. I forget exactly when, but it's basically this is why I phrased it this way before. Discourse around unemployment is a completely Fiat phenomenon. Forget exactly when it was, but it's sometime in the early 20th century, like 1910s, 1920s, basically. It goes from zero and it just skyrockets. Prior to that, so on the gold standard, basically, literally nobody ever talked about unemployment. It wasn't even a word that anybody used. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean for that to be too much of a rant, but I feel like you can probably relate to this.
Well, it's
being a filthy capitalist and all,
but
trying to employ people contrary to the whims of the state.
But this is the thing. It's trying to think of the words you can use to articulate the problems to try and help people understand that I'm on the same page as you. I actually want. Yeah, I'm not a leftist or a rightist now because I don't vote. I know the problems of politics.
Yeah.
But I want the same thing as you. When you say, "Oh, I don't want people to be poor." Yeah, I don't want people to be poor. I want people to be able to afford to feed their kids. Yeah, I want people to be able to afford to feed their kids. All those things that you want, but I just know it's ultimately cannot be saved always through the welfare system. And that's not to say there shouldn't be any welfare or anything that exists out there. I'm not a no welfare person. I'm not a no welfare absolutist at the moment. But the way to it was who said it to me? Talking about Africa. It was Marshall Long. He said, I've been out there. He said, you can have your charities and you can send money, but the way you're going to lift people out of poverty is through productivity. You have to create jobs, and I think it's the same. What you want is productivity, and if you tax me as a business owner, the harder you make it to run my business, and the higher you tax me, the less people I can employ, and the less profit I make, the less businesses I can create. The solution is to create productivity. I'm not saying switch off all this now and go straight to like very low tax. And what I'm saying is the trajectory's gone wrong. And through that trajectory, we might have maintained employment levels the same. Everyone below a certain threshold is certainly poorer, and we get in poorer. The only way is to change the trajectory is to create growth and productivity, but real growth and productivity, not inflated growth and productivity.
Not stimulating the economy.
And we're going to create more growth and productivity by allowing companies to be more profitable to invest.
Yeah.
And if you stimulate it, you might have a short-term productivity, but really you're going to just make the cantillionaires richer.
Yep.
And so
I should probably explain, by the way, because I've been saying this entirely sarcastically the entire time. By stimulate the economy, I'm mocking the Fiat economists who say that and actually mean it. Like, they don't say it sarcastically. I'm saying it sarcastically to make fun of them, because what is meant by this is more short-term credit to basically boost consumption, frankly. Like, not to invest, right? Just to make us feel richer, feel wealthier, but without any thought as to what actually creates wealth.
Yeah,
which is not consumption. It's the opposite, frankly.
It goes back. Is that socialism? Is that socialism for the rich?
Yeah,
that's what it is. Stimulus is socialism for the rich. It was who told me that? Oh, Texas.
I don't know.
Mushrooms.
Oh, Travis.
Travis Clean was the first person I heard coin that. Sorry. If my dad's
socialism for the rich?
Yeah, he said quantitative easing socialism for the rich.
I think within the financial system we walked through earlier,
we have to take pain. Like, there has to be some pain experience. Ray Dalio covers it in his economic cycles. You have
to sober up.
You have to sober up.
You can't keep drinking.
You can't keep fucking drinking. I'm worried about this social decay, but I do. But like I say, I think that's going to make it easier to explain things to people.
Probably,
Going
yeah.
back to what I was saying about the riots, when I saw all this, I was like, this is downstream from the fiat system we've created. This is an unhappy nation.
In part,
Yeah, in part. Yeah, of course, in part. But this is an unhappy nation. This is what the fuck is there for kids to do? There's no social clubs really anymore.
Yeah.
We've taken a lot of the green spaces. And to give you another fucking example, Bedford, tennis courts used to be free. Now they're not. Now you have to pay to rent the tennis courts. So kids who wanted, I could used to as a kid. We used to go up the tennis courts, play for free. Now you have to pay. What if you haven't got any money?
Yeah.
And so I think this. A lot of this is. I think a large part of this is the social decay that's coming from the decay of the financial system and the decay of our money.
I've got an idea for you as well. I think you'll like this. I don't know if this is where you were intending to go necessarily, but I think a lot of what you're describing. Well, you used this expression earlier, so I'm sure you're aware of this. You might just not think to articulate it this way, but you're describing the decay of social capital in large part, which is not really measurable, right? It's not quantifiable. It's just you just feel it. Basically, you see the consequences of it having disappeared. I'd even be tempted to link that to the comments you made about the welfare state. Again, kind of tiptoeing around being too overtly political. I have a view on, it's kind of completely in the abstract of the welfare state that I think is maybe more nuanced than people would probably expect coming from me. That I think you basically can't. It has to be context dependent. I think you can't talk about the merits or demerits of welfare without knowing which people and at what time you're actually talking about. I actually think that, to be fair, this is, I don't mean to go off on too much of a tangent, but I think a lot of politics is like this, frankly. I think a lot of political discourse is quite stupid by being made overly generalized as opposed to applying in a specific situation to a specific people at a time in a locality and whatever else. Going back though via welfare, social capital, I think that welfare becomes more necessary. And you could, I kind of don't mean that politically. If you want to be super cynical about it, you could even say something like, as a way of putting off rioting, for example, right? As basically bribing people to be peaceful when otherwise they're going to be violent, right? That's like really cynical way of interpreting it, but I think is like, it's not an unreasonable interpretation. It's a bit mean, but I think it's accurate enough for the most part.
A little bit. It's also vote buying. I mean,
that too, obviously. Yeah, sorry, not exhaustively that, but that's a fair interpretation of it. But I think what actually causes that need in the first place, which obviously is highly context dependent, right? It's like, who are these people? How angry are they? How violent are they going to be? Etc. That is downstream of the deterioration of social capital. So that's where I was going with all of this, right? The final leap I wanted to make, which is really fun in tying all of this together, is that, again, this is one of these things where it's part of it, it's not all of it, but I do think it's a necessary but insufficient component, is the inability to save. It's the extreme difficulty of saving. So we talked about this in like a much broader sort of financial economic context. I think we're now kind of moving on to more social cultural context of this. When you can't save, you can't plan, really. Yep. You can't, more importantly though, I think by being forced to think on a shorter and shorter time horizon, you out of necessity become more selfish and therefore less capable of being selfless, less capable of being charitable, less capable of basically having the time to invest in creating social capital in the first place. And so I've described it in kind of like, that's the direction in which it ought to move. Like that's the causal direction ideally, is that people build up savings, that gives them security, that then allows them to effectively build, this is a really interesting direction to go in, especially again, coming back to like diffusing political tension and crude stereotypes. That allows people to put time and energy and money, obviously, and resources into building non-market institutions to solve whatever problems they perceive themselves to have, which are intrinsically, by virtue of being non-market, they're very difficult to quantify. They're very difficult to tax, for one thing, as well, as opposed to in the absence of these kinds of institutions, which I'm arguing in large part comes about gradually, obviously not like all at once, but will gradually come about due to people's inability to save, causing this cascade, right? That's why you end up with what I'm arguing is a need for welfare in the first place, which is particularly unfortunate because that you can quantify. At that point, it's like, well, basically how much money do we need to throw at this problem for it to go away? I think that's I realize that logic is maybe a bit, I don't know, intellectual or something. I don't expect most people to have like gone down this entire train of thought on their own necessarily. It's not like a super obvious thing to try to think about, but I actually think that's quite, if you believe all of that, if you're roughly on board with what I'm saying, I think that's quite kind of ugly in a way. I think it's a really ugly outcome to reduce solving the problems that welfare is. I mean, you can argue about whether it even solves them or just makes them worse, but it's at least intended to solve by just reducing it to like a monetary figure. And again, it's going back to like, we're just basically bribing people. We're bribing them for votes and we're bribing them to not be violent. I don't want to live in that world. And it's not because, this is leading right back to your point, right? That my thinking there is not that I'm like Scrooge McDuck and I just want to swim in my bath of money and not give any to the state. It's about what kind of society I want to live in and what kind of people I want to live around.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've had a massive growth in private welfare over the last year. I mean, food banks to me is private welfare.
Yeah,
and it's become a necessity.
Yeah,
and again, it's a reflection on the trajectory that the public welfare now isn't enough, or that income levels are being outpaced by inflation. That you've got anything from people who are on social, who then need to also go to food banks to ensure their kids can eat or they can eat themselves. But you've also got workers. I mean, I made a film. I was in Harlow. We went to a food bank. There was a nurse there. She was, it felt for her. She was so embarrassed, but it's just like privately she told us, she said, "Yeah, I don't make enough money now as a nurse." She spends all day, every day trying to make people better. She doesn't make enough money as a nurse. My mum was a nurse. Okay, life wasn't great. We weren't wealthy, but my mum was a nurse. And just that we've got to that point that the people who've gone to years to study to make us better and to work in the NHS are now having to also then
so not to
shame
jump
themselves
around too much, but to tie a couple of these points together. So tying what we discussed a long time ago in terms of, what do I even mean by capitalism? How does fiat distort this? But also with your observations about where employment comes from, right? I would argue, again, not entirely, but in part, this exact problem that you're describing, even with this individual, like with this nurse, that is a consequence of, frankly, continuous malinvestment, right? So that's where this is coming from, is that there isn't the capital in place, whether financial in the sense of actually starting a business, but maybe even more importantly, social capital, which is why it's good we covered that too. There isn't the capital in place to enable basically her productivity at a level that we think she ought to deserve. Because instead, where all the capital has gone consistently is stimulating the economy.
Yeah.
It's just endlessly consume more, disincentivize real investment forever, and here we are.
It's depressing.
It's really sad. Yeah.
It's so depressing. Is your so your perspective on this is we may be able to slow this decline, but the only way out is a transition across to a sound money standard, and you think it's almost inevitable?
I think it's more inevitable the longer out you look. I'm really hesitant to predict anything more specific than that. At the very least, because I don't feel like I know at all. I really don't feel like I have any insight into how quickly this is likely to happen. But I think that's in large part because I'm suspicious that anybody can. But the reason I'm not a doomer about it, basically, is not that like, oh, nobody can know this. Like, maybe it would just get worse forever. I do think the longer out you go, the more likely it is that Bitcoin wins, or at least contributes to reversing course. And I think in large part that's due to something you alluded to, that the worse things get, the more appealing it becomes. And so there's a natural tension there that it can only swing so far before there's just like no other option.
I have this other thesis in my head that I've been thinking about quite a bit. And the bias is that I'm thinking of doing it myself.
Right.
In that, if you're able to get yourself to a certain financial position where you have the freedom to think more, create more, whether you're whatever it is we want to do, when you want to write music, make paintings, go for runs, whatever you want to do, you're going to have some people who are going to want to become politically political operatives of someone. That sounds more like a spy, but politically operational.
Yeah,
and they're going to do it from a position where they don't need to take from the financial system.
Yep.
And they're also going to do it from a position whereby they can't be cancelled.
Yeah.
And they don't. They're not relying on their government wage, and also a safe, secure political career that ensures they get their after dinner speaking slots when they retire, or their board seats at whatever fucking company. And so my thesis is that all they want is to reverse course this social decay and make the world a bit better for everyone else. So they will become this new wave of politicians who go in to make change, and drastic change. And the kind of change that I think we've seen with Malay, and again, I can't speak exactly, but I have friends there, and they're saying things are getting significantly better.
Maybe that's a good bookend to something we kind of disagreed about before, when I was saying, you push back on me saying it's politically impossible for example, Keir Starmer now to really do anything about, endless debt, right? I can amend that. So it's politically impossible for him, but not for you.
I think it's politically possible for him, but I just don't think he's got he's either not got the intelligence.
I think we're kind of saying the same
thing.
But realistically, he's not going to do it.
Yeah, but I think it's a really important point to make because it points to the character of people. Because if you're of high integrity and high character, you make unpopular decisions which are right.
Yeah.
And so I'm very firm in my belief. He knows and he's choosing not to do it, or he doesn't know, which means he shouldn't be in the fucking job. But I want people to go in and say, look, but it's going to take a special kind of person, and a personality, because it's going to require a personality to do it. And so I might not have it because I'm not particularly charismatic. Malay has a weird charisma whereby he just took my fucking prisoners, but was able to create cut through at the right time.
Yeah.
But we will have people of the right character or the right charisma who will be able to go in with new ideas where people have had enough. And I don't think we're far off here. And the reason I don't think we're far off is I understand why Labour won the last election, because the Conservatives were fucking terrible. But I wouldn't have voted for them. But I wouldn't vote for either. Because I know under either, it doesn't matter which one I vote, everything gets slightly worse.
Yep.
And the level of what it gets worse for you is dependent on their policies and your financial position. So it gets worse for me under Conservatives, but maybe not as worse as Labour because of my position. But for other people, it gets worse under Conservatives. It just depends who you are. So I don't want to vote in that system, but I'd love to be part of a solution. Just go and throw some fucking hand grenades. I do.
Do you think there's going to be an orange party?
I don't know. I don't think the world is ready for that as a particular answer. I mean, my only thing that I can only speak from my perspective. I've been considering for a long time now for running for mayor of Bedford, because you have quite a lot of power, and I just want some the two simple policies I want to do is mandate council tax reduction of 1% every year. So over the term, it's 4%. I don't know what that is compounded. I don't know if it's ever been done, probably not. And it's to prove it can be done by cutting efficiency and waste.
Yep.
And the second one is I want to eliminate every business rate in the town so people can go in there and create businesses. Yep. Just two slightly libertarian policies within the structure of government that might prove something.
Yeah.
And so if you can prove at a micro level in a town like Bedford, maybe other mayors will go, well, what's going on there? And maybe you can get some political capital to have some influence in Whitehall. Who knows? Yeah. I might be being utopian in my thinking.
I think there too, I think you get less utopian the longer out you look. I think this is basically saying the same thing in different
Fucking
terms.
necessity.
That if you think you can do this in the next year, then yeah, you're insane. But like the worst, I hesitate to say it as the worst things get, because part of me does want to like, I'm kind of an optimistic guy just in general, so I kind of want to think that there will be an element of people coming around for good reasons rather than just for, out of fear and necessity and so on. But yeah, for the most part, the more either of those happens, whether they're coming around for good or bad reasons, right? It feels true by definition to a large extent that the longer out we go, the more people will have come around and the easier this will be for you. And actually, for what it's worth, I'll back you if you had to live in Bedford, but I'll tweet about it or whatever. But I'm far more, I approve of that far more than a lot of, I think, what gets cheered on Bitcoin Twitter. I mean, you can't really take anything on Bitcoin Twitter that seriously, but for example, like Trump instituting a strategic Bitcoin reserve, or like, I don't see okay, yeah, that pumps all our bags, but does it actually, what that we've talked about now, does that solve? Nothing. What you've just talked about contributes at the margin to enabling people to accumulate capital.
Yes.
That matters.
Yes.
Fucking Trump buying 1 million Bitcoin. As great as it would be for the bags, like, we do need to acknowledge this. Like, I will be significantly richer if he does that. Great. It doesn't solve what I'm actually concerned about.
I also don't, but I don't really think that is the outcome that most people are thinking is the important one. It's if he does that, he legitimizes it.
Yeah,
I think that's what really people want, and that's all I would want to do. Is I don't want to force it. I just want to legitimize it.
Yeah.
Allow there to be honest conversations about it, which we've started to see a little bit in the media. It's definitely getting better. We're seeing better articles. The FT have done it. They've started to write things like, well, maybe I was wrong about this. I think the FT's article is like, why won't Bitcoin go away or something? Yeah. It was like an attempt to move. I just think we need honest conversations with people who aren't incentivized in a way that net screws the whole fucking country. Yeah. And that's going to require different political voices, more courageous reporting, and probably the decay that we really need is the corporate media decay, which is just full of bullshit. And it's just, and it's going to be slow steps. And maybe it's this podcast, maybe it's another podcast, but there's this kind of like two things which are kind of happening at the same time. This kind of social decay, but rising like opposition forces, opposition narratives, which counter that, but are also legitimate. And so hopefully, it'd be like a tango. Hopefully we can turn it. We can turn it around. Hopefully.
Yeah. Well, just to follow up on that, though, I want to clarify a point about what I mentioned about the strategic Bitcoin reserve or whatever they call it. It's not that I would dislike for that to happen, for Trump to do that. My point is more. I don't think I really articulated this very well. My point is more around the reception to the proposal. That disappointed me in the sense that I don't see how that kind of thing in general is really what we want. And I think a couple of things you mentioned there tie all of this together really, really nicely. So that to me is, I think probably to everybody, is just kind of it's very top down, right?
Yes.
It doesn't reflect any bottom up initiative. And I think if anything, a lot of the things we've talked about, so what you've just mentioned about corporate media decaying versus alternative but increasingly legitimate approaches to disseminating information rising, even it's a bit different in terms of the mechanics, but I think conceptually it's very similar. The welfare state versus, or welfareism in general, versus intangible social institutions that solve the same problems. On all of these issues, what we prefer, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure you feel this way, is the ones that are, again, I don't want to use it like decentralized as kind of a meaningless buzzword at this point, but are bottom up. I think that's a better way of describing it, that reflect people, frankly, this tie in another point we've covered, people actually taking responsibility rather than just hoping somebody's going to save them. Yeah,
listen, job creation, the capital creation and accumulation, wealth creation, a shrinking of government, and a more productive class. God, I wish I could remember Harry Sudak, what he would say. we want the foot of the vultures taken off the neck of the productive class.
Right.
Something like that.
It was along those lines.
Yeah, he sounded really articulate and sexy when he said it. But it's
That's very Randian.
Look, it's to grow the productive class and shrink the unproductive class. That's what I want to see happen. And like I say, I think we all want the same thing. Unless you're a psychopath, we want everyone's life to get better, and we want the trajectory of people
very
away from
controversial points you have running for mayor.
Well, it goes back to
I
that-
want life to be better.
But it goes back to that Millet speech, and I'd like a lot of people to see it. He frames the most productive period of the last few hundred years when there was real productivity and real productive growth. And I think we just need to get people to understand the reality of where we are right now and why we've got there.
Just to be clear though, the contrast to Malay is interesting. I think particularly in the UK, to touch on a bunch of things that we've talked about, right? Because for him, I mean, I'm not enough of an expert in Argentina, I think, to give too deep an analysis, but their problems are very different to ours. If anything, they're a lot more obvious. That's maybe something that worries me a little bit. We've kind of covered this.
Yeah, but do you know what he said?
What do you mean?
It was almost like, you've seen that. Tell me if I've got this wrong, Danny, but it's almost like he said, I've come from the future.
Yeah.
Like, I've come from the future to tell you where you're headed. Because we've done all of this.
Yeah.
And I know where you're going. And this is all the mistakes you're making.
Yeah.
I love the fact he delivered it the way. But yeah, and so it's just how do you package this up so people understand it at a level which it meets what they think the world should be and where they think the world should be headed. Because you can explain it and they don't fully grok it, but you need to grok that this is the answer to the problems they've identified.
Yeah.
If we can get there, then we will all be in a better place.
Vote for Pete.
No, fuck that. I don't actually think I will be political anyway. Danny, anything else?
I don't think so.
Anything we've not asked you wish we had, or touched on you wish we had?
I don't think so.
Well, loved it. Always do. Love talking to you.
Likewise.
Listeners, check out Bitcoin Venice. Great book. And Alan, I appreciate you and
Thank you very much.
good luck. And thank you to everyone.